Serious, what's your story of seeing somebody's mental state degrade? My mother had cancer, and at the very end, maybe the last 2 weeks, there was a very rapid deterioration of her mental state. At first she'd say something a little off, like she had a couple of seizures, and I think she heard something about a Mediterranean cruise on TV, so she suddenly said, "I have the Mediterranean shakes. It goes like this," and she kind of moved her arms in a shimmy. After a few seconds she went, "Jesus, I'm losing my marbles," and we all, me, her, my sister, and my father, had kind of a sad laugh together. Little things like that went on for like a week. Then she started talking to people and commenting on things that weren't there. But she knew her mind was playing tricks on her. I remember my uncle, her brother, came up from Florida to say goodbye, and it took her a few minutes to realize she wasn't imagining him. She died a few days later. Those were 2 very hard weeks for 15-year-old me. Especially because on her 49th birthday just 5 weeks prior she seemed perfectly healthy. I of course knew she had cancer, but it seemed like she would pull through. Man, I haven't thought about that in a while. That was hard to write. I watched a friend get overtaken by his first bipolar episode in about 3 weeks. He started smoking a lot more weed than he had before. He was on Snapchat and social media non-stop. He started drinking heavily as well, and barely sleeping. He totaled his Jeep and got a DUI. He went to his job and told his boss to duck off, among other things. He was fired. He started getting angry very easily. During this time I spoke to his mom to let her know what was going on, but she was in denial still. The drinking and mania continued for another week. He went golfing with some friends, and as they were driving home, he lost it and started ripping his clothes off and tried to jump out of the car. They pulled over and he was screaming for someone to come and kill him. They calmed him down enough to get to the hospital, where he stayed for a few days. This all happened in 3 weeks. He's better now, which is really good to see. My cousin has schizophrenia. When I was a kid I remember him being completely normal. Then he joined the Navy and apparently got bullied a duck ton. When he came back he was 100% different. He would just stare into nothingness. He didn't say anything. Sometimes he'd laugh, but he wouldn't smile while doing it, and it'd be so dry and robotic. Ha, ha, ha. He totally broke down. My mom has a brain tumor since I was barely able to make my own memories. It's so deep in the brain that it can't be removed. I witnessed firsthand the devastation of what failed surgeries can do. Although the tumor is benign, it presses her brain and it creates a liquid that affects other areas, causing epilepsy and other side effects. She's basically a toddler now that, although she can, sometimes, remember me, she can't take care of herself at all. She degraded over the years, but I don't have memories of a healthy and capable mother. My early memories involve visiting her in the hospital. Grandma. She had Alzheimer and dementia. She started losing her memory slowly over time. Then one day she fell and broke her hip. Being bedridden accelerated her illnesses, and within a couple of months she was just laying there and staring at the roof, barely speaking, and all she says is nonsense. She doesn't recognize anyone, not even her children. It's like she's not there anymore, and all that's left is her body. The sad part is that she's been like that for years. Dead but not really dead. That we can't even mourn her, probably because all the sadness and tears were shed while her body still lies on her bed. My fiance's mom passed a few years ago from Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, CJD for short. CJD is most commonly called mad cow disease, even though they aren't the same. CJD only happens to humans and mad cow is bovine. CJD is when these proteins in your brain called prions go crazy and start to fold and basically turns your brain into Swiss cheese. There is no cure and it is very rare. Only a few hundred cases a year. She was perfectly healthy except for being diabetic, but she had 0 complications with her diabetes. Then out of nowhere she started having problems remembering things and then starting having mood swings. She went to the doctor, but they couldn't figure out what it was. It wasn't until a month or so later that a specialist diagnosed her with CJD. She went from being completely healthy to not being able to move her arms, legs, control voluntary and involuntary functions, and then death in 8 months. It was extremely hard on my fiancée to see her mom lose everything that made her who she was. Her own mother and father had to see her deteriorate as well. I was just awful for the whole family. My own. I went from a happy 13-year-old to being molested for 3 years, dropping out of school, becoming a drug addict/dealer for 20 years, married, then divorced. Wasn't till after that I got help, had some time in a hospital, got anti-depression medication then, and only then realized I had been depressed and going downhill since the age of 13. 7 years later, been drug-free for the whole 7 years. I'm off meds now and enjoy life. My group of friends witnessed 2 friends go through paranoid schizophrenic breakdowns, one after the other, in the space of 2 years. The second one was my roommate. It happened very suddenly. He just woke up one day and decided that we were all lying to him all the time, and acted with the hostility and contempt that you would expect from someone who thought those things. He did erratic stuff like smashing all his belongings with a baseball bat in a driveway and piling all his socks on the kitchen floor. He eventually went back to his parents' house, which was a relief. From what I have heard, he never really got the help he needed. Me. Recently found out that it actually started a year before I thought it had. Being manic is a hell of a drug. I'll tell ya. I was a powerhouse during my junior year, but don't really remember my last 2 years of high school. Sadly, had a full-on mental breakdown the last semester of my senior year, till I got diagnosed bipolar. I was a shell of my previous self. Didn't eat. Rarely went outside. Didn't talk to my numerous friends. It was a hard time for my parents, seeing me deteriorate so completely. I mean, I went from being one of the most popular kids in my high school to barely being able to get out of bed. My parents don't talk about it. So I am a nurse in an assisted living facility. Most people there have dementia. Of course, I have plenty of stories of sundowners or hospice patients. However, this person just stuck with me when I was an aide at a local hospital. There was a woman who came into a med-surg unit. She was middle-aged, so not old. I don't remember why she was on our unit, but I remember it had something to do with a car accident. But she was so smart. She had 2 doctorate degrees and enriched many lives at a local college. I just remember being in awe of the conversations I would have with her when I had the time. She was there for a long time. I remember saying goodbye to her at the end of the shift and her commenting that she was going to a rehab facility. A few months go by and she came back. I remember seeing her name and being excited to see her. When I went to her room, she didn't recognize me, which wasn't too odd. Sometimes our regulars didn't recognize me. However, she didn't even know how to use the remote for the TV. She could still for the most part take care of herself with minimal help. But something was off. I told the nurse who had taken care of her the previous night about the status condition change, but the nurse didn't do anything. The next times I had her, I just watched her decline, become incontinent, unable to care for herself, mood swings, all of those. It was the saddest thing I had ever seen at that point in New York career. She ended up passing in the hospital. I will never forget the intelligent, strong woman I had met just months ago become almost a shell and non-verbal so quickly. I never saw a visitor there even once. It's happening right now and it's not fun to watch. My cell rang at 3 a.m. last night. It's my mother calling, asking if the tomato plants in the backyard have fruit. As I am typing this, my phone is ringing and it's her. She is in the adjacent room and partially within my line of sight. People forget that Parkinson's just doesn't make you shake. It's muscle rigidity, muscle mass loss coupled with cognitive decline. Honestly, I don't know how people like Michael J. Fox manage to continually survive. It ain't money related, because there is no magical drug cocktail that prevents it from getting worse. My brother was always a little bit off. Most of the times, it was perceived as an effect of a serious medical condition he had as a child. He was intelligent, bright as hell, exceeding in academics field. So most of his weird mannerisms was written off. You know, beautiful mind / weird nerd kind of stuff. But there was something else that he kept hidden from his mother and our father. He was experimenting with anything psychoactive he could find, combining it with regular stoner stuff, lucid dreaming, meditating. He slowly disappeared from social life and became weirder and weirder to talk to. When we talked for the last time, he went on about being one with his astral plane and about how we should both escape to China, where chips implanted in our bodies will have no signal. He was taken to a mental institution about a week after that, diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, and released on his first leave after 3 months. As I was in our hometown at the time, I planned to visit him after he was released. We were set to meet on Saturday, but he died on Friday evening. I want to believe that in his last moments he aimed to finally become one with the astral world he created in his mind, and not a broken young man who came to realization that for his whole life he will have to fight with a severe illness. Took me about 2 years to finally make peace with what happened. But I guess he'll never forgive the medical professionals who had let him out for the leave. When I was in graduate school for psychology, my aunt and uncle called me over to their house because my cousin refused to get out of bed or go to work. When I got there, I witnessed my cousin in his bed laughing at random statements he made, smiling in a bizarre way, and looking at me and saying lewd comments about sexual behavior and what he wanted to do with me. This was completely out of character. I told my aunt and uncle something was clearly not right, and I suggested we take him to a behavioral health center. They balked at the idea, insisting my cousin was just trying to get out of going to work. Meanwhile, my cousin gets out of bed and became agitated, shouting random sexual comments and saying he was going to beat everybody up. We called the paramedics, and they had to restrain him and then took him to the behavioral health center. My cousin was placed in a locked holding area, and he kicked the walls, jumped around, and yelled. It was hard to watch. The intern psychiatrist asked me several questions pertaining to my cousin's genes. My cousin was adopted and we didn't have any valid information. Anyway, his diagnosis ended up being schizoaffective disorder. He's never been the same. This heavily involves psychedelics. But a friend went from being shy and not very talkative to very erratic with suicidal spouts and just eventually shutting themselves off. I watched my father steadily lose his mind after the passing of my mom. He seemed to go through every stage of grief apart from acceptance. 5 years of what appeared to be a heartbroken man was actually a schizophrenic one. The diagnosis, often triggered by a traumatic event, resulted in his denial. He claims he's well. I can confidently say, he is no longer the person I remember to be my dad. His voice is different, raspy from the constant shouting at auditorial hallucinations. He no longer smiles, laughs. He is always paranoid and furious. Although my story is about him, I've been more so affected by the people around him. Once his diagnosis was brought to light, various family members began to pity him, walk on eggshells around him, and the most bothersome, talk to him similar to that of a baby. He marches around demanding we acknowledge the fact that he is not retarded. I hope those reading this learn to treat others, especially those victims of losing a loved one, understand to treat them with dignity. My dad is not a broken person. He is a changed person, one still healing.